everyone. Welcome to the Backstage Classical Career Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Katrina Stroud, and I'm a classical violinist who started playing at the age of 3. I graduated from the Robert McDuffie Center for Strings at Mercer University with my bachelor's in violin performance, and I'm pursuing my master's in music at the University of Michigan. In this series, I invite esteemed classical musicians onto the show and interview them to tell their stories and give advice to share with others and preserve their legacies. For today's episode, I'm interviewing Paul Watkins, an incredible cellist, conductor, and pedagogue. Last year, Mr. Watkins conducted the McDuffie Center students and faculty, including David Kim, Annie Fullard, Robert McDuffie, Amy Schwartz-Moretti, Lawrence Dutton, and Jeffrey Turner at Carnegie Hall, which was an amazing experience. It was an honor to play alongside my mentors in one of the greatest halls in the world, and to be led by Mr. Watkins, whose musicianship, wisdom, and humor inspired us all. For those of you who don't know Mr. Watkins, he has a varied and distinguished career as a soloist, chamber musician, and conductor. He was a member of the Nash Ensemble until he joined the Emerson String Quartet in 2013. Mr. Watkins performs regularly with the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center and at festivals worldwide, and regularly appears as a concerto soloist with orchestras throughout the world. Since winning the Leeds conducting competition, he has conducted many of the major orchestras throughout the UK, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Mr. Watkins has recorded Britain's Cello Symphony, the Walton, Delius, Elgar, and Lutoslawski concertos, Mendelssohn's music for cello and piano, and an ongoing series of British sonatas with his brother, Hugh Watkins. In 2014, he was appointed Artistic Director of the Great Lakes Chamber Music Festival. Thank you so much for joining me today on my podcast. I'm so excited to have you. How and when did you start playing the cello?
Oh, wow. That's going back quite a few years now. But I think I started when I was around about 7, somewhere between my 7th and 8th birthday. And I started because I didn't like the violin. My dad, he's a very enthusiastic amateur musician, school teacher by profession, a German teacher, but really good violist, and is still playing. He's, goodness me, what is he now? 84, I think. Still reading chamber music every week with his friends. But at the time, his best friend was a violinist, and they couldn't usually find a regular second violinist for a quartet. So they were kind of stuck reading string shows, which is not bad, but it's a more limited repertoire. So I think he really wanted me to learn the violin when I took an interest in music so that he'd get a foursome for a string quartet. I tried, and I think maybe I lasted for about 6 weeks. But there was something about holding the thing up, and it just didn't work for me. But another friend of his, with whom he still plays quartets, and we're talking like, this is now 50-odd, well, not quite 50 years ago, 40-odd years ago, he was the cellist. He came around, and I liked him. He was a bit younger than my dad, and a bit cooler. And he had the biggest instrument, so when they were reading music, I think I would kind of hide under the table. They kind of read music in the dining room and pushed the dining room table out the way. I would hide under the table and listen to it.
Oh, wow.
And so somehow looking up at this cello, and I think maybe I even felt the vibrations of it through the floor. He had the end pin in the floor. I just thought, this is the greatest instrument. This is the coolest. This is the instrument for me. Told my parents. They could kind of tell, I think, anyway. And it happened that this chap, Stephen David, my dad's friend, was also the local cello teacher. So he said, well, fine, I'll set him up with a cello and give him lessons. And he was my first cello teacher. He got me going.
Wow, that's such a fun story. I love that. So what was your musical education like, and how did it shape you as an artist?
Oh, which I was very, very lucky, I think. I had a great musical education, musical parents, to start a musical family, not professional musicians, both high school teachers. As I said, my dad, German teacher, my mother was a music teacher. So yeah, she was she had a music degree, trained musician, beautiful singing voice, like many Welsh people. Not me, unfortunately, but so there was a lot of music in the household, and they used to like going to concerts. As I said, my dad would play chamber music on the weekend, so that sort of started me off. And then I was extremely fortunate to benefit from a good local music education system in South Wales at the time. We're talking the late 1970s into the 1980s, where you could get free instrumental lessons in school.
Wow.
And that was funded by the local council, the local authority. And I think it gave a lot of people like me the chance to start playing an instrument without massive expenditure. The local county had a stock of instruments. So, as I say, Stephen David started me off on the cello, and that was fine as I grew up through, the 3/4 size to the 7/8 size, to the full size. My family didn't have to outlay masses of money, but obviously when the time came for me to get a full size cello, that was all absolutely fine. So that I started there. Then I went to regular school in South Wales. But I think when I was around about 12 years old, I started to sort of pull away, maybe in terms of enthusiasm and level from other kids my age, and people sort of went, "Oh, he's quite good at this," Maybe he should consider going to a music school. And there are a number of independent private music schools in the UK. I think maybe 5 or 6, can't remember exactly. And because, again, of an old friend of my father's, who his daughter had gone to the Yehudi Menuhin School, which is just outside London. He said, well, why don't you have him audition, and see what happens? You can sort of see what he's like on a sort of national / even international level. And I was game for that. So I went and auditioned, and, well, blow me down, I got in. So from the age of 13 to 18, I went to the Menuhin School, and that's what really lit a fire under me, and everything else seemed to sort of follow from that, really.
Yeah, that's amazing. An amazing school. So who were some of your musical mentors at the school and outside of the school that influenced and developed you as a musician?
Oh, well, gosh, plenty. I mean, at the Menuhin School, my teachers, I had 1 year with a distinguished British cellist called Antonia Butler, and this is in 1983, and I think she was already in her 70s then. She'd been quite a successful British soloist in the 1940s, really, I guess, or 40s and 50s. She was my first cello teacher. She'd actually studied with Julius Klengel in Leipzig in the 20s, so there's an extraordinary sort of link to the past there. But she retired after a year, and then I had a teacher who I consider my main teacher, who really taught me everything about the cello that I still rely on today, and that's a wonderful woman called Melissa Phelps, who was a student of Johannes Goritsky and of Paul Tortelier and Joan Dixon, and she really just made everything work really for me on the cello. She's still teaching today at the Royal College of Music in London. So she was my main teacher. But all the cellists at the school got to see William Pleath, the legendary British cello teacher who was Jacqueline Dupre's teacher, among many others. And he would come in maybe once a month, once every 6 weeks, and give more sort of masterclass style lessons. Very, very inspiring. Really, really wonderful. And then finally, I ended up having some lessons in Germany with Johannes Goritsky, who was again had an amazing sound. That was the incredible thing about him. Between Stephen David and going to the Menuhin School, I had a marvelous Canadian cello teacher called Sharon McKinley, and she was also extraordinary. So I'm very, very lucky to have some marvelous teachers.
Yeah, those are incredible teachers for sure. And so you eventually joined the Emerson String Quartet, but what happened in between you finishing your schooling and joining the Emerson String Quartet?
Well, this is one of those little areas of my life that I don't really have any regrets at all, but I was somehow a very, very good student from a young age, academically and musically, and just played by the rules, and I didn't do anything unusual. After the Menuhin School, I went to Cambridge University to read music, because in my last year at the Menuhin School, I discovered a taste for conducting, going over to the dark side. And people encouraged me, mentors and teachers, to apply for university, because Cambridge University is a place that has, traditionally produced and educated some wonderful British conductors. But when I got there, I felt like a bit of a fish out of water. It wasn't really right for me. So I did my first year there and sort of scraped through the exams. And I really felt that I was in the wrong place. Well, it was the right place, but it was the wrong time for me. So I talked to my academic advisors, and they were wonderful, really, really sympathetic, listened to me. They knew that I was playing a lot and starting to play concerts at that time around the UK. And they said, well, why don't you take a year off and we'll keep your place open for you. You can decide what you want to do. So I actually dropped out of Cambridge. It wasn't that dramatic because I knew that if it didn't work out, I could go back. Moved to London and really started to kind of seek my fortune as a player. And I needed to live and pay my rent, so I sort of applied to lots of orchestras to get substitute work. Didn't succeed really in that. I mean, there's hundreds of cellists in London trying to get substitute work at the age of 19 or 20 or whatever. But I auditioned for the BBC Symphony Orchestra. There was a job going there, co-principal cellist. Not expecting to get it, but just thinking, well, at least they'll hear me and they'll perhaps they'll put me on their list. Anyway, I ended up getting the job, and that was the start of that, really. So I cut short my academic studies and went into the real world.
Oh, I see. Wow, amazing. So, and then what led you to meet the members of the Emerson String Quartet, and what was that audition like?
Wow, well, goodness me. I mean, it sort of starts, I guess, with my wife, Jennifer, who is an American. She was born in New York to musical parents, very musical parents. Her mother, Ruth Laredo, great concert pianist, and her father, Jamie Laredo, the wonderful violinist and conductor. So I met her in my early 20s at the Marlborough Festival. So that was the first time I'd been to the States. She came back to live with me in London. And, as a result of that, I started making lots of connections in the United States. And, I was still working in London. And, eventually I think I must have come onto the Emerson Quartet's radar, probably David Finkel's radar at first, who was the long-time cellist of the quartet. And he invited me, I think, to play at Music at Menlo, maybe even at the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center. So he sort of knew me. So I think when he decided that he wanted to leave the quartet to pursue all his other avenues, he may have even hinted to the quartet that I was out there and I might be the sort of person they would like. So I think that's how the connection happened. And the audition itself was quite a sort of cloak and dagger affair, because they wanted to keep it very, very quiet. I don't think they were auditioning any other people. They certainly talked about other cellists, but David seemed pretty convinced that if they could persuade me to join, I would. So I flew over to New York and stayed in a hotel. Normally I'd go to New York. I knew a lot of people there, but I stayed in a hotel and kept very, very quiet. Went over to Gene Drucker's apartment and we read quartets very, very happily for a morning, and then kind of looked at each other and smiled and went, well, I think this could work, and that's kind of how it happened. It was not that formal, really. It just felt right. I think that's probably why it worked out for the last 10 years, because we all clicked, I think.
Yeah, that's amazing. Wow, I love that story. And so what was it like joining such an esteemed and established quartet? And do you have any memorable moments or stories to share from that time?
Well, I always say, people make these analogies about wonderful chamber music groups or even orchestras, like, conducting the Berlin Philharmonic, is like driving a great Mercedes or a Rolls Royce or something. They always seem to make these motoring analogies, and it really did feel like I was joining. I was getting into this luxury car where everything kind of worked. But I could somehow influence it subtly. That it was a very responsive. I don't want to call it a machine, a string quartet, but maybe a responsive organism, I think you could call it. So yes, that was a great thing. I started to learn their particular quirks with certain pieces. And funny enough, I was coaching at Stony Brook University, where we still have a Emerson Quartet Institute. We all still teach there. Just last week, a young quartet was performing Beethoven's Opus 59 number 2, which starts very dramatically with two stark chords, rom, beam, like this, and then a silence, and then the thing goes on. And we, this was the Beethoven Opus 59s were pieces that we played very early on in my time with the quartet, and we rehearsed. And it was all absolutely fine. And I remember going out on stage for the first time, and cellists are a bit like this when they get on stage. they have to make sure the seat's okay and the end pin and all that. There's a little bit of messing around. And I was indulging in this sort of, getting adjusted, thinking and before I know it, Phil Setzer, who's got his playing first in that piece, he's got his violin up and he's off. It's like, and I was like, oh my God. So there were certain pieces, and that was one of them. Opus 95 is another one where Phil was playing first in the first violin, where he really liked to really just get out on stage and start. Fantastic dramatic effect, but it caught me out a few times before I learned the ropes there.
What was it like playing in a quartet that had alternating first violinists? Was that something new to you?
It was really interesting, and something that I think being a student and being at the Menuhin School kind of prepared me for that, because in the time that I was there was quite a strong emphasis on string quartet playing.
Okay.
I'm not sure that there were any young quartets there where they switched first and second violins, but Menuhin was extremely keen that all the violinists at the school played the viola as well. So there was definitely a lot of switching between violin and viola. So I was always used to seeing, I never thought of certain students as violists because I'd also see them with a violin under their chins. So I was kind of used to that kind of switching around, and we played chamber music with a lot of different people. But what I think was interesting to me, having known the Emerson Quartet from really my teens or 20s and listened to their recordings, particularly the Bartok recording, where before I knew them, I found it very difficult to tell who was playing first violin, who was playing second violin. The balance between the two of them was just so extraordinarily equal. I think as the quartet got older, more mature, they let their different characters come out a little bit more, perhaps. I don't know. This is my view. I'm not sure what Phil and Jean would probably have something else to say about this. So it was really lovely for me to enjoy the differences between the two of them, as well as the similarities,
Yeah, that's amazing. And such an amazing career you've had with the Emerson Quartet. You said you went to Cambridge for conducting. What originally got you into conducting, and what inspired you to pursue that path alongside your performance career?
Yeah, the conducting, that comes from being a failed pianist, I would say. Oh. Not completely failed, but I started as a kid at home playing the piano, and my mother's mother, lived with us at the time, and she was a former chapel organist in Wales, so she really knew her stuff. She knew the rudiments of music, theory of music. She taught me scales and a little bit of harmony, and really got me started on the piano. So I was always popping up and playing the piano, and I still play the piano to a certain extent these days. But when I got to about 12 or 13, when I got to the Menuhin School, I think my cello playing and my piano playing were at a roughly similar level. Some of my mentors then, particularly a marvelous man called Peter Norris, who was the director of music at the Menuhin School at that time, such an intense listener and an incredible sort of instinct for young musicians and where they were going. He sort of took me aside after 4 or 5 months at the Menuhin School and said he thought that my real musical voice was coming through the cello. So that actually let me off the hook a bit, because I was just getting to the stage where I was going to have to start learning, Chopin etudes and Rachmaninoff and really difficult stuff on the piano.
Yeah.
So I thought, we'll leave that. But I've always kept up a certain level of piano playing so I can read, like classical sonatas. And in my studio at Yale, I often play for my students,
Okay.
So yeah, I'm a good sight reader on the piano. You asked me about how I got into conducting, and it was really through that pleasure of having all the parts available to you as a pianist. You get the whole picture of the piece.
Right, yeah.
Unless you're playing solo something or other on a violin or a viola or whatever, that made me think, I kind of like this sort of grander overview. And a few of the teachers at the Menuhin School, I would often turn up in my friends' lessons, violin and viola and cello lessons, and play piano parts for them, because the real pianists at the Menuhin School were too busy learning their virtuosic stuff. So I could go and sight read. And some of the teachers would say to me, "Oh, you're very good at." I was very good at following the instrumentalists and listening and all that. And they said, "Oh, you play the piano a bit like a conductor." And that was, someone told me that, and that put a little light bulb on in my head. So that's how I got from piano to thinking about conducting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what led you to go back to conducting after taking a break from it for a little while?
Well, I mean, I guess it was really joining the Emerson Quartet, actually, because I was a bit, up to that point, which was 2013. I was doing almost half and half cello playing and conducting when I was in the UK. I was the cellist of the Nash Ensemble, wonderful chamber group, mixed strings, wind, piano, for 16 years before the Emerson Quartet. But we were never as busy as the Emerson Quartet in terms of number of concerts. So I had time to do that, a few solo things, and some conducting, which sort of came my way after I won a conducting competition, the Leeds conducting competition in the UK, when I was, I don't know, 30, I think, something like that. But then really, once I moved to the States, I had to focus seriously on, learning all this quartet repertoire, and the concert, we did 80 to 90 concerts a year, more as we approached our final seasons. So it was pretty difficult to fit any kind of conducting in. But eventually I made a few sort of inroads and started conducting a couple of American orchestras and conducting at Stony Brook, for example. So I'm hoping that there'll be more of that in the future.
Yeah. And we're jumping around a little bit in your career, but going back to the 80, 90 concerts a year for the Emerson Quartet, what were some things you learned touring around the world with this quartet?
I learned how to pack a suitcase efficiently. I learned how to buy how to get the lightest possible cello case, carrying it on and off trains and in taxis and through airports. What I learned about them was the amazing way that they got on with each other, because they'd all been together, Larry and Gene and Phil, for 40 years prior to me showing up on the scene. They'd been together with David as a foursome for 34 years, unbroken. There was another cellist beforehand, Eric Wilson, who teaches up in Vancouver, for a couple of years. But they used humor a lot to diffuse potentially difficult situations. It's difficult to travel around as a musician. Modern day travel is incredibly frustrating and annoying, and they somehow managed, everybody allowed themselves to be grumpy, but never for it to get personal or to linger on for more than, an hour or so.
I see. Yeah.
So, and they had extraordinary stamina too, to get up at, play a concert, get up at 5 o'clock in the morning the next day, fly to another city. Mostly, I would say, uncomplaining. I used to say, I said pretty quickly after a year in the quartet, I said, I've never worked as hard as this in my life. But they were always conscious of how privileged they were and how lucky they were to have this career. And they weren't going to complain about it. They really took it in both hands. So I think that's the major thing that I learned from the Emerson Quartet was the importance of taking nothing for granted.
Yeah. That's so inspiring. And I'm sure very fulfilling to be a part of as well.
Really something, yeah.
Yeah. You have such a multifaceted career. What were some of your career aspirations while you were in school, and what led your career to develop over time to so many different paths?
I think that also, in the end, that also came from Menuhin and the philosophy. He changed his philosophy quite a bit as he got older. But at the time that he founded the Menuhin School, he really wasn't focused narrowly on producing virtuoso instrumentalists. Obviously that was large part of what was going on there, very intensive instrumental lessons. But he also said, and this was something that I think my parents thought was rather good because they didn't really want to push me in that way. When they read various sort of, brochures and literature about the school, that Menuhin said he would be equally happy for children who go through his school to come out not even as musicians, but as teachers, chamber musicians, orchestral players, whatever. He had the broadest range. That was his intention at the time. So I took that to heart, I think, and I thought, that's why obviously I focused quite hard on the cello, but I didn't let the piano go. And when people opened the door to conducting, I thought, well, I'll try that as well. It's all music, really.
Yeah, for sure. So you now teach at the Yale School of Music. What got you into teaching and got you to Yale?
Well, again, long path, all sort of starting back at the Menuhin School, because even at the Menuhin School, when I became one of the older kids, sort of what the equivalent of a junior and a senior in high school in the States, we already started to mentor younger kids a little bit, because the age range for the Menuhin School was theoretically sort of 8 to 18. So there were some very small kids there as well. Never any 8 or 9-year-olds when I was there, but certainly 10, 11, 12-year-olds. And I remember I was assigned 1/2 an hour, what they called supervised practice, with a wonderful young cellist called Thomas Carroll, who was really young at the time, maybe about 11 years old, 10, 11 years old. And I got to supervise his practice for 1/2 an hour. So that gave me a taste of trying to explain things about the cello. And then I think in my 20s, once I'd got the job in the BBC Symphony Orchestra, the Royal Academy of Music approached me and asked me if I'd like to start some teaching there. So I taught there for 7 or 8 years. Then I stopped when the conducting took off, and then I did master classes here and there. And as part of touring with the Emerson Quartet, we did quite a lot of coaching too. Plus, we were coaching at Stony Brook, so I would teach there. And I think it was after a year or two of me turning up in the States and joining the Emerson Quartet that Yale started looking at me as a potential successor to the great Aldo Pariso, who had been teaching cello at Yale for the last 60 years, which is quite amazing. So, I mean, I can't believe how fortunate I am to have that job. It's extraordinary, and wonderful cellists, and constantly inspired by that.
Yeah, that's amazing. And how have you developed your teaching methods, and how are your teaching methods still developing to this day?
Oh, I think they change daily, probably, my teaching methods. So, I think it's a slow process, actually. And when I got the job at Yale, I happened to be having lunch with another mentor of mine, a very inspiring violin teacher based in London called David Takano, who was head of strings at the Guildhall School for a long time, still teaches there now. And he was a violin teacher at the Menuhin School when I was a kid, so I used to go to his lessons, and he's been a very important figure in my life. And he gave me a small piece of advice about improving. I said, gosh, this is really a big thing for me. I've never had a class of 12, 13 cellists before. The most I'd ever taught was 6 or 7. How am I going to, this is a very serious job, how's it going to be? Because he'd been teaching for 50 years. And he said, the one thing that you'll find is that you will improve, but in increments of 5 years. I thought, wow, that's a really long view, but actually quite useful advice, because I think I'm always a bit suspicious of anybody who says they have a teaching method, or, I've got a way of doing things, because, teaching is it's ever changing. I think, the student comes in on a weekly basis. Sometimes you see them more than that. They're a different person from day to day. They have some similarities, of course, at stay, but one has to be responsive to their needs at all times, I think, not just put them in a box and put them through a regime. Some students need that a little bit more than others, and I do, with new ones who come to me, give them my technical ideas have really kind of taken shape over the last 15 to 20 years. Much more than they, in my 20s and 30s, I couldn't have been doing this job. I didn't have it quite worked out as to how I think the cello is best approached. But I've got a pretty good idea about that now. But musically, I'm always wanting to be surprised. That's the main thing. And that's something that you can't legislate for. You can't write a syllabus about that. You just have to take what's given to you and use all the experience that you have. So that's sort of how my teaching changes, really. I just try to be as open as possible on a daily basis.
Yeah, I love that perspective. Thank you for sharing that. Like I've said, you had such a multifaceted career. How have you balanced all these different aspects of your career and your life?
Well, sometimes I haven't balanced them at all. They've been like all over the place, really. Um, the cello is the sort of anchor, really. And again, it takes, for me at any rate, it takes a long time for me to realize certain patterns in my life and the way I am. But I've realized now that if I go without playing the cello for much more than about 4 or 5 days, um, I start getting physical symptoms. I start getting a bit jumpy. I've been very lucky, apart from one incident in the pandemic where I had a trapped nerve in my left arm, not to have suffered many physical issues when playing the cello. But I'm finding that the older I get, the longer I leave it, my body starts tensing up, and it's like, I need to do something here. Because with conducting, it's a marvelous thing. I can sit at this desk here. I've got a very nice view out into the garden. I mark up scores. I can think about the music. It's not a technical thing.
Mm.
And if I get too involved in that for too many days, my arms start crying out and saying, "Where's the cello? Where's the cello?" You go to the cello, do some practice, immediately feel better. So that's sort of how I balance things. The cello is really the center of things.
Yeah. And I like to close with this one question. What advice do you have for aspiring professional musicians?
Oh, right. I wish it was my original advice. I happen to agree with it, but a close colleague and friend of mine at Yale, the violinist Suvin Kim, just told me this in passing, that he thinks that the best approach you can have as a young musician is literally to show up for every single thing that you do, whether it's a theory class, a history class, a violin lesson, playing a scale, doing a wedding gig. Show up for it as if you're playing at Carnegie Hall, as if it's your debut recital. Take everything seriously, and every time you're with the instrument or away from it, give it everything you've got. I think I've done an awful lot of things in my life, and we haven't even touched on all the commercial things I've done, movie sessions, TV sessions, all that kind of thing in London. I think there's no such thing as a bad musical experience. You can learn something from anything you do when you touch the instrument. So that's my advice.
Yes, that's great advice. And I'm sure how you've been able to lead such an incredible career. Thank you so much for telling me your story and for sharing everything today.
Thanks, Katrina. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you to Mr. Watkins for an incredible interview about his very successful and multifaceted career. As he mentioned, we didn't even cover the full extent of his recording career, but what he said about chamber music, orchestra, conducting, and teaching was so insightful and inspiring. Thank you so much for joining me on Backstage Classical Career Conversations. If you would like to support this podcast, please leave us a rating and review on the platform you're listening to this on. You can follow us on Instagram at Backstage Classical Podcast, and be sure to tell your friends and family to share these career stories from some of the top musicians in this country. I'm Katrina Stroud, and it was great to see you here. Until next time, stay inspired and listen to the stories of others.